"You're terminated! Hand over your apron!" The soft glow of Hawthorne's diner lit up the night as Eleanor Monroe wiped down the counter. It had been another exhausting shift. Nothing glamorous, yet it paid the bills. Outside, through a large window, a neon sign advertising 50% off for veterans bathed the damp sidewalk in a subtle crimson hue. The diner was modest, a few weathered red booths, the inviting aroma of fresh coffee, and an old jukebox tucked into a corner. But it had its own charm. Suddenly the doorbell chimed. Eleanor looked up as an elderly woman entered, moving with deliberate care as if bearing an unseen burden. Dressed in a worn cardigan and scuffed shoes, the woman clutched a neatly folded military cap. Elena's heart tightened at the sight. The cap was held as though it were priceless. Offering a warm smile, Elena greeted, "Welcome to Hawthorne's. Just you tonight?" The woman hesitated before softly replying, "Yes, dear. Just me." Eleanor then guided her to a quiet booth by the window. The woman settled into the booth and carefully placed the cap on the table, as if it belonged to someone who should be by her side. Swallowing back a lump, Elena fetched a coffee pot. A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming cup and set it in front of the woman. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked. The woman briefly scanned the menu before looking away, her fingers tightening around the cap as if drawing strength from its fabric. I don't have enough," she murmured, barely audible. At those words, Eleanor's chest constricted. She recognized this scenario all too well, people too proud to ask for help when they need it most. Without hesitation, she smiled. "It's on me." The woman's head jerked up, eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. I can't let you do that," she whispered, shaking her head. Eleanor knelt and gently covered the woman's hand. "It's just dinner," she said softly, then glanced at the neatly folded cap on the table. "It looks like you've earned it." The woman's lip trembled. After a long pause, she finally whispered, "Thank you." Without waiting for further response, Eleanor patted the woman's hand and walked to the register. She pulled a crumpled $20 bill from her own pocket and processed the order. Unbeknownst to her, that small act of kindness was about to change everything. The ambient hum of the diner faded as Elena completed the transaction. After setting the meal before the woman, Elena slid the $20 bill into the register, a modest gesture that granted the elderly woman both a warm meal and a measure of dignity. Just then, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Elena." Her stomach sank as she turned to see Andrew Collins, the diner's manager, emerging from his office doorway. With crossed arms and a tense jaw, his disapproval was unmistakable. Struggling to remain composed, Elena replied, "Yes, Andrew." Andrew stepped toward the counter and eyed the plate in front of the elderly woman. "Did she pay for that meal?" he demanded. Swallowing hard, Eleanor answered, "No." Andrew exhaled sharply. "And who did you expect to cover it?" Meeting his gaze, Eleanor said, "I did." Andrew's expression darkened. "You used your own money." Eleanor nodded. Andrew scoffed. "And you thought that was acceptable?" Eleanor's fists clenched at her sides. "She's a veteran's wife, Andrew. She just needed a warm meal." Andrew let out a dry laugh. "That's not your concern." The elderly woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Lowering her gaze, Elena felt anger well up inside her. "So is this our policy now? To cast aside the families of veterans when they're struggling?" Andrew's lips pressed into a thin line. "You break the rules. You face the consequences," he replied coldly. "That's how it works." Turning to the woman, he added, "Mom, I'm afraid I have to ask you to leave." The diner fell silent. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she reached for her military cap, her face flushing with humiliation. At that moment, something within Eleanor snapped. Faced with a choice to to stay silent and lose her job or stand up for what was right. She declared firmly, "No." The single word echoed in the still air. Andrew's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Straightening her shoulders, Elena stated, "She's not leaving." Andrew advanced, looming over her. "This is my establishment. If I say she must go, then she goes." Elena held her ground. "If you're going to kick someone out, you should start with me." A tense silence followed as Andrew's nostrils flared. Finally he said, "You're fired." Elena's breath caught. Though she had anticipated it, the words struck like a blow. The elderly woman gasped, "Oh dear, no. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Turning to her, Elena offered a gentle smile. "Don't apologize. You did nothing wrong." With deliberate care, she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. Her hands were steady, but her heart felt heavy. Andrew smirked. "Then off you go." Lifting her chin, Elena replied, "I know where I'm going." With each step toward the exit, the weight of her decision grew. Just as Elena reached for the door, the bell above it jingled. The door swung open, and a group of soldiers entered. Elena froze. 5 uniformed men moved with quiet confidence, their presence immediately commanding attention. Customers shifted in their seats as murmurs spread through the diner. Andrew's smug expression faded. The lead soldier, a tall man with sharp eyes and an assured stance, scanned the room before focusing on Elena. "Who's Elena Monroe?" he asked. After a brief pause, Elena replied, "I am." The soldier continued, "We need to speak with you." Andrew interjected, "Gentlemen, this isn't a military facility. If you're hungry, we can—" But the soldier ignored him, keeping his attention on Elena. "We heard what happened tonight," he stated. Elena's heart pounded. "How did you find out?" she asked softly. Then the soldier turned to the elderly woman still seated at the booth. "Ma'am, is it true that you are the wife of Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Novak?" The woman's eyes widened. After a moment of silence, she slowly nodded. "Yes." At those words, the soldiers straightened. One of them, a younger man with a scar along his cheek, stepped forward. "I served under your husband, ma'am," he said quietly. "He saved my life." A soft cry escaped her as tears welled in her eyes. Elena's throat tightened as she watched the scene unfold. The lead soldier then turned back to Elena. "What you did tonight didn't go unnoticed," he said. Elena stammered, "I just paid for a meal." The soldier shook his head. "No, you did far more than that. You showed compassion when no one else would." His gaze shifted to Andrew, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. "We don't take that lightly," the soldier added. Elena, still reeling, couldn't find the right words. Her hands trembled with adrenaline. Andrew scoffed, trying to regain control. "Well, I'm sure this is a touching moment, but she's no longer our employee. She's free to leave." The soldier's smile was thin and devoid of warmth. "Oh, she's leaving," he stated, his tone clipped. Andrew stuttered. "Yes, she is." Then the soldier fixed his gaze on Andrew. "There's someone here who wants to meet you," he said. Elena's stomach flipped as Andrew nervously glanced between them. "Who?" she asked. The soldier's lips curled into a knowing smile. "You'll see." Elena stood frozen, absorbing everything that had transpired. The soldier's words echoed in her mind. Someone wanted to meet her. She felt as if she had stepped into a world far beyond her own. Meanwhile, Andrew, now Elena's former manager, laughed dryly. "This is absurd," he muttered. "She's a waitress, not a war hero." At that, the lead soldier's eyes snapped to Andrew, who instinctively stepped back. "No," the soldier said evenly, "but she understands honor, a quality I can't say for some people." Andrew opened his mouth to argue, but then fell silent, realizing there was nothing more to add. Overwhelmed by disbelief and uncertainty, Elena felt a stirring of something else, something hard to define. Just minutes earlier, she had lost her job. Now, standing among soldiers, that loss seemed trivial. The lead soldier motioned toward the door. "Come with us," he instructed. Elena hesitated, glancing back at the elderly woman in the booth, her eyes red, her hands still trembling, yet now carrying a hint of relief. Elena gave the woman a small nod before turning back to the soldiers. Taking a deep breath, she followed them out the door. Outside, the air was crisp and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. A military vehicle sat parked at the curb, its engine humming softly. "Where are we going?" Elena finally asked, as the soldier held the door open for her. "You'll see soon enough," he replied as she climbed in. Nervous energy buzzed within her as the door closed behind her and the vehicle pulled away. A heavy silence filled the cabin as they drove through the city. Elena stared out the window, her mind racing with possibilities about what could be so significant. After what felt like an eternity, the vehicle slowed and turned down a quiet street bordered by tall iron fences. At the end stood a large, well-lit building with an American flag gently swaying in the night breeze, a military base known as Fort Liberty. Elena's stomach knotted as the vehicle came to a stop. The lead soldier beckoned her to step out. With each step, her shoes crunched softly on the gravel as they approached the building. They passed by guards who nodded respectfully at the group. Elena felt as if she were entering an entirely different world. The lead soldier opened a side door and invited her inside. The moment she entered, her breath caught. Seated behind a large oak desk, clad in full uniform, was a high-ranking officer. His posture was impeccable, his expression unreadable, yet the look in his eyes, a deep, unwavering gratitude, captivated her. He rose as she approached, locking eyes with her. "You must be Elena Monroe," he said in a steady, warm voice. "Yes, sir," Elena replied, nervously taking the seat he indicated. After a weighted pause, the officer leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "I heard about what happened tonight." Elena hesitated before saying, I thought it was just a meal." The officer's lips pressed together. "It's not just that," he explained, as he reached into a drawer and produced a small framed photograph, turning it so she could see clearly. Elena's breath caught as she saw a younger version of the elderly woman standing beside a man in uniform. The man looked strong and proud, his arm protectively around his wife. "That man was Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Novak," the officer said quietly. "He was one of the finest men I ever served with. He saved lives on the battlefield and sacrificed everything for his country." Elena felt her throat tighten as the officer met her gaze once more. "His wife has been struggling for years, trying to make ends meet. Tonight, someone reminded her that her husband's sacrifice still matters, that she still matters." Elena blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. "You didn't just pay for a meal," the officer continued. "You restored a piece of dignity, and that is something we will never forget." For the first time since losing her job, Elena felt a surge of pride. Then the officer rose and retrieved a small box from his desk. Opening it, he revealed a modest military insignia pin. Stepping around the desk, he gently placed the pin into Elena's hand. "This is our token of appreciation," he said. "It may be small, but it represents our gratitude." Elena gazed down at the insignia in her palm. Although she had never served in the military or stepped onto a battlefield, in that moment, she realized her actions truly mattered. Looking up, she managed a quiet, "Thank you, sir." The officer nodded firmly. "There's one more thing," he said. "We run a veterans outreach program, and we need caring people. People like you." Elena's eyes widened. "You want me to work with you?" The officer smiled gently. if you're interested. After a shaky breath, Elena replied, I'd be honored. As the officer extended his hand, Elena shook it firmly, and in that moment, her life changed forever. Back at Hawthorne's diner, Andrew Collins stood frozen, his face pale and his breath shallow. Applause began from a few customers, a woman by the counter, a man near the window, and soon the entire diner was on its feet, clapping in admiration. She did the right thing, one woman declared. This is what respect looks like, another added. Andrew's jaw tightened as he searched the room for someone to share his disapproval, but found none. Then his phone vibrated sharply. He fumbled it, his hands suddenly clammy when he saw it was from the owner of Hawthorne's diner. Hello? Andrew answered cautiously. The owner's voice was icy and clipped. I just saw the video, he snapped. Andrew's entire body tensed. I can explain, he stammered. Explain? You fired her, the owner barked. Andrew swallowed hard. Yes, sir. What were you thinking? Do you have any idea how fast this is spreading? The owner continued. Andrew's heart pounded as he glanced at the video, recorded by a customer near the window, that had already amassed hundreds of thousands of views. The caption read, Waitress stands up for veteran's widow, gets fired on the spot. Comments scrolled by in a mix of outrage and support. This is disgraceful. Who owns this place? I'll never dine here again. She deserves a promotion, not to be fired. Someone find her a job ASAP. Andrew's grip tightened on the phone as his boss's next words came, low and foreboding. If you don't fix this immediately, you'll be the one out of a job tomorrow. The line went dead. Slowly, Andrew lowered the phone, his heart hammering in his chest. His gaze finally shifted to Elena, still standing near the entrance with an unreadable expression. Though the applause had subsided, every eye in the diner was fixed on him. Andrew licked his lips, struggling to salvage what remained, forcing a strained smile. Elena, he began, I think we may have been a bit hasty. Elena remained silent, merely tilting her head as she regarded him. Andrew emitted an awkward chuckle. I suppose we could negotiate, perhaps even reconsider, he suggested. Elena raised her hand. Stop, she interjected, taking a measured breath. For the first time in years, she experienced a sensation she hadn't known in this place before. Empowerment. I don't need this job, she stated, her tone calm yet resolute. I never did. Andrew's mouth opened and closed in a stunned, almost inarticulate manner, as if gasping for air. Elena shook her head. You didn't fire me because I did something wrong, she continued. You fired me because you were too much of a coward to do what was right, Elena declared. Andrew's face flushed a deep red, and he had no retort. Taking a step back, Elena allowed her final words to hang in the air. Then, without looking back, she strode out the door. It was at that moment that the deep rumble of an engine reached her ears. Elena froze. A large military vehicle had just pulled up in front of the diner. The door swung open, and a soldier, the same one who had entered earlier, stepped out. He was not alone, as another vehicle pulled in behind him. Soon, a convoy arrived, one vehicle after another. The hairs on the back of Elena's neck stood on end. The soldier advanced toward her with a subtle, knowing smile. Miss Monroe, he said, halting a few feet away. Elena swallowed. Yes, he observed, studying her for a moment before reaching into his pocket and producing a neatly folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. Elena hesitated before accepting it. Upon unfolding the page, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't an ordinary note, but rather a job offer. I told you, Monroe, the soldier said steadily. There is someone who wishes to meet you. Elena's grip on the letter tightened as she looked up, her mind whirling. What sort of job? She asked cautiously. The soldier's smile widened ever so slightly. "One where you can genuinely make a difference," he replied. Just hours earlier, Elena had believed that losing her job was the worst that could happen. Now, as she observed the military insignia printed on the letterhead, she realized it might be the best thing to ever occur. The soldier then stepped back, motioning toward the waiting vehicle. "Will you come with us?" he inquired. Elena exhaled slowly, nodded, and climbed into the vehicle, her old life left behind and a new chapter just beginning. Sitting in the back of the military transport, Elena Monroe stared at the job offer in her hands, her fingers tracing over the embossed insignia on the official letterhead. It was almost unbelievable. Just hours ago, she had been a waitress, and now she was being presented with an opportunity far grander than herself. Lifting her gaze to the soldier seated opposite her, Elena asked in a quieter voice, "A different kind of job?" The soldier nodded. "We're expanding a veterans support program," he explained. "We need people who truly care, people like you." Elena's throat tightened as she listened. All her life, she had merely worked for a paycheck, surviving on routine. But now, she saw a chance to make a genuine difference. Her thoughts drifted to the elderly woman at the diner and the way she had clutched that faded military cap as though it were the last remnant of her husband. Elena recalled how that cap had been cherished, as if it held the memory of all that her husband had been. She had witnessed the cruelty and indifference of the world toward those who sacrificed the most. Now, she had a chance to change that. Slowly, she exhaled. "What exactly would my role be?" she inquired. The soldier's smile deepened, sensing her growing interest. "You'd help families of veterans," he said, "ensuring they don't fall through the cracks. We need someone who can connect with them. You already possess that instinct." Elena paused, reflecting on her previous job and how Andrew had treated the elderly woman as if she were invisible, as though she didn't matter. She thought of the many others struggling in silence. This, she realized, was her opportunity to make a change. Meeting the soldier's gaze, she nodded firmly. "I'm in." The soldier's smile broadened. "Good choice," he remarked, as the vehicle rumbled forward, carrying her toward a new future. By the next morning, Elena's name was everywhere. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages. Friends, family, and even people she hadn't spoken to in years reached out with congratulations and thanks. It wasn't until she turned on the television that she understood the full impact. A national news anchor was discussing her. The story of a young waitress who had stood up for a veteran's widow and been fired for it had captured the hearts of millions. What began as a simple act of kindness had now blossomed into a movement, sparking widespread conversations about how society treats its nation's heroes and their families. Elena's stomach churned as she watched the footage from the diner play on screen. The broadcast included scenes of the confrontation with Andrew, the moment Elena removed her apron, the soldiers entering, and then came clips of people reacting online. Social media posts flooded the screen with messages like, "This is what humanity should look like," "More people like Elena are needed," and "Our veterans and their families deserve better." Elena's chest tightened with emotion. All she had ever wanted was to do what was right. She never imagined that moment would spark such an outpouring. The camera then cut back to the anchor, who explained that, in response to the overwhelming support, several organizations had reached out with new opportunities for Elena. One such opportunity was a veterans advocacy program where she would work directly with military families in need. Elena blinked in disbelief. It was real, truly happening. Her phone buzzed again, and she looked down to find a message from the elderly woman she had helped. "Thank you, Elena. I thought the world had forgotten about us, but because of you, I know that's not true." Overwhelmed, Elena pressed her hand to her mouth. Although she had lost her job, she had discovered something far more important: a purpose, a chance to stand up for those who had stood for their country. It had all begun with one simple act of kindness. Elena exhaled slowly and smiled. Sometimes, doing what is right not only changes someone else's life, it transforms your own. In today's world, kindness often seems rare. People are too busy, too distracted, or too afraid to intervene when they see injustice. Yet Elena's story reminds us that even a single act of compassion can have a ripple effect, changing everything. She had not hesitated to help a veteran's widow, not for recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That simple act set off a chain reaction, growing into something much larger than she could have ever imagined. How many times have we seen someone in need and walked away, thinking it wasn't our problem? Perhaps it was a struggling veteran at the grocery store, an elderly neighbor in need, or a single mother counting change at the checkout. It's all too easy to look away, but what if we chose instead to step in, to defend, to help, even when no one is watching? The truth is, the world doesn't change through grand gestures alone. It transforms through small, everyday acts of decency. Have you ever experienced a moment of compassion that rekindled your trust in humanity? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, subscribe to Ancient Stories Hub, where genuine heroes show us that honor endures, because some tales don't merely alter lives, they touch souls.